Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
As the night went on, their banter, flirting, and competition only intensified. The game played on the multiple screens surrounding them, each touchdown and turnover technically significant to their fantasy matchup, but increasingly peripheral to the far more engaging contest happening at their table. "Your tight end just dropped a pass," Kristin observed with smug satisfaction, sipping her third drink of the evening. "Looks like those hands aren't quite as reliable as you claimed." Daniel's eyes never left hers as he replied, "Sometimes the most rewarding plays require patience. Rushing leads to fumbles." The double meaning hung in the air between them. Charged and deliberate. "Interesting perspective," Kristin countered, leaning forward slightly. "Though in my experience, hesitation can cost you the game." "Sometimes you need to," she paused, deliberately running her tongue across her bottom lip. "Drive directly into the opening when you see it." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only indication that her words had hit their mark. "Aggressive strategy," he acknowledged, his voice dropping to that dangerous lower register. "High risk, high reward," she completed the thought, holding his gaze with unwavering confidence. A cheer erupted around them as someone scored, their fantasy players momentarily forgotten as the real-life game provided background noise to their increasingly charged exchange. "Do you know what I think, Thompson?" Daniel asked, pushing his empty glass aside and leaning in closer, close enough that the conversation became instantly more intimate despite the crowded bar. "Enlighten me," she invited, matching his posture, the space between them narrowing to something that challenged the boundaries of propriety in a public establishment. "I think neither of us gives a damn about who wins this fantasy league," he stated with blunt honesty. "I think we've been playing an entirely different game for weeks now." The directness was both surprising and refreshing, cutting through the pretense they'd been maintaining. "Bold statement," Kristin replied, though she couldn't suppress the smile that curved her lips. "What makes you so sure?" Daniel's answering smile held equal parts confidence and heat. "The fact that your running back just scored a touchdown that puts you firmly in the lead, and you didn't even glance at the screen." Kristin blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. She'd been so focused on Daniel, on the electricity crackling between them, that she'd completely missed a play that significantly improved her chances of winning their bet. But deep down, Kristin already knew the truth. She had known it for weeks, perhaps from that very first meeting when he'd walked into her office and scrambled every coherent thought in her head. The fantasy football rivalry, the dinner bet, the competitive banter, all of it had been elaborate window dressing for the undeniable attraction neither of them seemed capable of ignoring. This wasn't just about the bet anymore. It had never really been about the bet. The wager had simply provided a convenient framework, a socially acceptable reason to spend time together, to extend their interaction beyond professional boundaries without explicitly acknowledging what was really happening between them. This was about them. About the way his voice made her pulse quicken. About how time seemed to accelerate in his presence, hours feeling like minutes. About the increasingly frequent moments when their usual sharp-witted exchanges would pause, suspended in a moment of genuine connection that transcended the verbal sparring they both excelled at. "You're staring," Daniel observed, his voice gentler than usual. The competitive edge temporarily softened. "Am I?" Kristin replied, not bothering to deny it. "And here I thought I was being subtle." His laugh was warm, genuine. "Subtlety isn't exactly the theme of the evening," he pointed out, his gaze making a deliberate journey from her face to the expanse of skin revealed by her crop, top and back again. "Not that I'm complaining." "Good," she said simply. "Because I dressed for a specific audience tonight." The admission hung between them, more direct than anything she'd said previously. Around them, the bar continued its Saturday night revelry. Patrons cheering at the game, servers weaving between tables, music occasionally rising above the general din. But within their private bubble, a significant shift had occurred, a line crossed from implication to explicit acknowledgement. A very appreciative audience, Daniel assured her, his expression suddenly more serious. Though I have to ask, why tonight? We've been dancing around this for weeks. What changed? And tonight? How? Tonight she was going to make sure Daniel Carter finally got the message. No more ambiguity, no more plausible deniability, no more professional distance carefully maintained despite the obvious chemistry pulling them together. Maybe I got tired of waiting, she replied honestly. Maybe 2 months of anticipation is my limit. 2 months, 1 week, and 4 days, Daniel corrected with surprising precision. Not that I've been counting. The fact that he knew exactly how long it had been since their first meeting sent a pleasant jolt through her system. He'd been just as aware, just as affected, just as focused on whatever this was between them. That's specific, she observed, unable to keep the smile from her voice. I'm detail-oriented, he replied with a shrug that failed to convey casualness. Especially when the details matter. Because after 2 months of dancing around each other, she had made her decision. There had been reasons for the delay, for the careful distance she'd maintained, despite the increasingly powerful pull between them. Fear of complicating a potentially lucrative business relationship. Uncertainty about navigating intimacy in her new identity. Concern about moving too quickly into something that felt surprisingly significant. But at some point between their first meeting and tonight, those reasons had stopped mattering. Or rather, they had been eclipsed by something more compelling, the undeniable recognition that whatever was happening between them deserved to be explored, regardless of complications or uncertainties. Your defense just intercepted a pass, Daniel noted, nodding toward one of the screens. That pretty much seals your victory. Statistically speaking. Is that concession I hear? Kristin teased, though her focus remained on him rather than the game. The great Daniel Carter, admitting defeat. Let's call it recognizing priorities, he replied, his expression shifting to something more serious, more intent. Some contests matter more than others. The implication was clear, the subtext unmistakable. Whatever was happening on those screens, whatever points their fantasy players were accumulating or losing, it was secondary to the far more consequential interaction unfolding between them. She was going to make him hers. The certainty had been building for weeks, crystallizing into absolute clarity tonight. This wasn't mere attraction or simple chemistry. It was something rarer, more compelling. A recognition, perhaps, of complementary energies, of matched intensities, of someone who could challenge and engage her on every level. Another round, the server asked, appearing at their table with impeccable timing, or terrible timing, depending on perspective. Daniel glanced at Kristin, a question in his eyes. Actually, Kristin replied, making a decision in that instant, I think we're good. Just the check, please. The server's knowing smile suggested she understood exactly what was happening. Coming right up? As she walked away, Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. Leaving so soon? The game's not over. Isn't it? Kristin challenged softly, holding his gaze with deliberate intensity. I believe you just acknowledged my statistical victory. So I did, he conceded, a slow smile spreading across his features. Which means, according to our bet, I owe you dinner anywhere you choose. I'm not interested in collecting that particular prize tonight, Kristin informed him, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private, despite the crowded bar. No. Daniel leaned closer, the movement bringing him near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Could detect the subtle notes of his cologne beneath the bar's ambient scents. What prize did you have in mind, then? No matter what. The determination had solidified within her, becoming less a decision and more an inevitability. Tonight, the careful dance would end. Tonight, the tension that had been building since that first electric meeting would finally find its release. "I think," Kristin replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, "that's a conversation best continued somewhere with fewer spectators." Daniel's eyes darkened at her words, the blue deepening to something closer to indigo. "Your place or mine?" he asked, direct and unambiguous. "Mine is closer," Kristin answered simply. As Daniel signaled for the check, his movements carrying a new urgency, Kristin felt a surge of anticipation that was equal parts exhilaration and certainty. Game night had just taken an unexpected turn, and the real victory had nothing to do with fantasy football. Kristin stretched her arms above her head, a smug, satisfied smirk on her lips as she leaned back against the bar stool. The movement caused her crop top to ride up slightly, revealing another tantalizing inch of toned midriff, a fact she was acutely aware of as Daniel's eyes tracked the motion with undisguised appreciation. The television screens throughout the bar were displaying the final statistics, the numbers confirming what they both suspected during the fourth quarter. The final fantasy football scores were in. And guess what? She won. By a mere 3.7 points, a margin so slim it could have been erased by a single completed pass or an additional tackle, but a victory nonetheless. Her team had held on through a nail-biting final drive, her defense making just enough stops to preserve her slender lead. "Thompson's Titans defeat Carter's Crushers," she announced with theatrical formality, gesturing toward the nearest screen, where their fantasy app displayed the results in vivid detail. "Let the record show that I am officially the superior football strategist." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the results on his phone. The gesture tousled his already disheveled locks, giving him an even more appealing rumpled appearance. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head in a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. His reaction was all the more satisfying because she knew how rare it was. Daniel Carter, by all accounts, was accustomed to winning, in business, in personal endeavors, in life generally. His success wasn't accidental. It was meticulously engineered through intelligence, determination, and that relentless competitive drive she'd witnessed firsthand over the past months. Kristin grinned, unable to resist twisting the knife just a little. "What's wrong, Carter?" "Not used to losing." She took a sip of her drink, watching him over the rim, with playful mockery dancing in her green eyes. The bar around them had begun to thin somewhat as the game ended, though a steady crowd remained for post-game analysis and continued drinking. Daniel looked up at her, his stormy blue eyes glinting with amusement, rather than the frustration she might have expected. There was something disarmingly attractive about his willingness to accept defeat with grace, a confidence that suggested losing a fantasy football league did nothing to diminish his self-assurance. "Not usually, no," he admitted, with a candid shrug that rippled the fabric of his Henley across his broad shoulders. "But I guess there's a first time for everything." His voice carried a note of suggestion that had nothing to do with football statistics, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made the ambient temperature of the bar seem to rise several degrees. Kristin leaned in, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper that required him to incline closer to hear her over the bar's persistent noise. "Get used to it." The double entendre was deliberate, her words laden with promise that extended far beyond their fantasy rivalry. This close, she could detect the subtle notes of his cologne, mingled with the leather of his watch strap, a combination that was becoming dangerously familiar. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head as if marveling at her audacity. "All right, Thompson. You win." He raised his glass in a toast of concession, the movement casual, yet somehow elegant. "To the better strategist this time." "This time," Kristin repeated with mock offense. "I sense a lack of proper respect for my decisive victory." "Decisive," Daniel countered with a raised eyebrow. You won by less than 4 points. That's not domination. That's luck, says the loser. Kristin shot back with a smirk, enjoying their verbal sparring perhaps more than the actual victory. Temporarily humbled competitor, Daniel corrected with dignity. But before we call it a night, he stood up, stretching before turning to her. The movement emphasized his height, his lean muscular build beneath the casual clothing. How about a walk? The suggestion was unexpected, disrupting the trajectory she'd been anticipating. She'd assumed they'd finish their drinks, perhaps engage in another round of increasingly charged banter. And then, well, the evening had seemed to be heading in a very specific direction. Kristin tilted her head, intrigued by this apparent detour. A walk? Yeah, Daniel confirmed, reaching for his jacket draped over the back of his stool. Through the park. It's a nice night. Clear skies, almost full moon. He shrugged into the jacket with fluid grace. Unless you're afraid of being alone with me in the dark. The challenge was playful, but carried an undercurrent of heat that made her pulse quicken. The nearby park was a popular spot during daylight hours. But at this time of night, it would be largely deserted, quiet, secluded, private. Kristin rolled her eyes but stood up, gathering her purse with deliberate unhurriedness. Please. If anything, you should be afraid of me. She settled her bill with practiced efficiency, adding a generous tip for Tina, who had kept their drinks flowing throughout the evening. The bartender caught her eye as she processed the payment, giving her a subtle thumbs up and mouthing "Get it, girl," when Daniel's back was turned. Daniel gave her a slow, knowing look as they prepared to leave, his gaze dipping over her figure before meeting her eyes again. The appreciation was frank, unambiguous, but carried a respect that prevented it from feeling offensive. "Kristin," he murmured, her name on his lips somehow more intimate than any endearment could have been. His voice was deep and smooth, like aged bourbon, rich and intoxicating. "You have no idea." The simple statement held layers of meaning, implications that sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. There was a promise in those words, in the way his eyes darkened when they held hers, in the subtle tension radiating from his body, despite his casual stance. Kristin's heart jumped in her chest, but she kept her composure, arching a brow in deliberate challenge. The dance between them had shifted tonight, becoming more explicit, more intentional. But neither seemed willing to fully abandon the playful competition that had characterized their interaction from the beginning. "Come on, Carter," she teased, nudging his arm with her elbow, the casual contact sending a jolt through her system that belied her nonchalant tone. "Take me for a walk before I change my mind." They made their way through the crowded bar, navigating between tables and groups of lingering patrons. Daniel's hand found the small of her back, a light touch that guided without controlling, protective without being possessive. The warmth of his palm radiated through the thin material of her top, creating a focal point of sensation that made her hyperware of his proximity. Outside, the night air was crisp with early autumn coolness, a refreshing contrast to the warm, beer-scented atmosphere of the bar. The street was alive with Saturday night energy, people moving between venues, laughter echoing from patios, the distant thump of music from a nearby club. "Parks, this way," Daniel indicated with a slight nod, his hand dropping from her back as they established their direction. The loss of contact was both disappointing and exciting, a reminder that whatever happened next would be deliberate, chosen, not the result of circumstance or proximity. "So," Kristin began as they fell into step beside each other, "about that dinner you owe me. I'm thinking Paris might be nice in the spring." Daniel laughed, the sound genuine and warm in the night air. "Paris? You don't think small, do you, Thompson?" "Why should I?" she countered, with a confident smile. "A bet's a bet, and I won fair and square." Fair and square. With a significant assistance from luck, Daniel amended, though his tone remained light, teasing. But, yes, a bet's a bet. Though I should warn you, if we go to Paris, I know a restaurant so exclusive it doesn't even have a name. Just coordinates and a password. The waiting list is approximately 2 years. Unless you're Daniel Carter, tech innovator extraordinaire. Kristin guessed, glancing up at him with knowing amusement. His answering smile held a hint of boyish pride that was unexpectedly charming. The chef owes me a favor. Or 3. They approached the park entrance, a wide pathway flanked by ornamental lampposts that cast pools of golden light at regular intervals. Beyond the entrance, the path curved between trees, whose leaves were just beginning to turn with the season, creating shadowed corridors interspersed with illuminated clearings. After you, Daniel gestured gallantly, standing aside to let her precede him onto the path. Such a gentleman, Kristin remarked with a teasing lilt. Though I have to wonder if your motives are entirely chivalrous. Daniel's gaze met hers, direct and unapologetic. They're entirely selfish, actually. The view is significantly better this way. The candid admission startled a laugh from her. Unexpected, genuine, slightly breathless. You're incorrigible, you know that? I prefer to think of it as refreshingly honest, he countered, falling into step beside her again as they moved deeper into the park. Life's too short for games. At least, the kind without clearly established rules and mutually agreed upon prizes. His words hung between them, loaded with implication as they continued their walk. The path before them was clear, well lit at intervals, but with stretches of shadow between, much like the evening that stretched ahead, defined by moments of clarity, interspersed with tantalizing uncertainty. The air was cool and crisp, the sounds of the city fading as they walked through the quiet park, their footsteps soft against the pavement. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of trees, creating dappled patterns that shifted and moved with the gentle evening breeze. The park was mostly deserted at this hour, occasional joggers or dog walkers passing at a distance, but largely they had the meandering paths to themselves. Kristin walked right next to Daniel, their arms occasionally brushing, sending little sparks of warmth through her. Each incidental contact seemed to carry more significance than it should, the brief touch of his sleeve against her bare arm, the momentary press of his shoulder against hers when the path narrowed, the back of his hand grazing her fingers as they walked side by side. Your heels holding up? Okay, Daniel asked, glancing down at her footwear with a mixture of admiration and concern. Not exactly standard park attire. Kristin smirked, appreciating both his attentiveness and the opportunity to showcase a skill she'd mastered over the past months. These, please. I could run a marathon in these boots. Now that I'd pay to see? Daniel chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made him look boyishly charming, despite his usual commanding presence. Neither of them spoke further at first, but the silence between them was comfortable, an easy kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. It was a surprising discovery, this ability to simply exist in each other's space without the constant verbal sparring that had characterized so much of their interaction. The quiet felt intimate, meaningful, as if they'd progressed to a level of connection where words were sometimes superfluous. The path curved around a small ornamental pond, the surface glassy and still, reflecting the moonlight and the surrounding trees in perfect detail. A wooden footbridge arched across one narrow section, leading to a more secluded area of the park. Kristin suddenly stopped, nodding toward a nearby bench under a street lamp. The iron bench was positioned to overlook the pond, bathed in the soft glow of the antique-style lamp that cast a circle of warm light in the surrounding darkness. Let's sit, she suggested, her voice softer than usual, almost tentative. Daniel glanced at the bench, then back at her, his expression momentarily unreadable before he nodded. The bench was cool beneath them, the iron still holding the chill of the evening air. Daniel settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, not quite touching, but near enough that the slightest movement would bring them into contact. His cologne, that now familiar blend of sandalwood, and something darker, spicier, mingled with the natural scents of the park. Earth, water, autumn leaves. For the first time that night, Kristin felt nervous. It was an unexpected sensation. She'd been confident at the bar, self-assured in her calculated outfit choice, certain in her decision to move their relationship forward. But now, in this quieter, more intimate setting, with the anticipation of what might happen next hanging between them, she felt a flutter of uncertainty that was both alarming and strangely exhilarating. And she wasn't sure why. She'd been on dates before, both as Kyle and more recently, as Kristin. She'd experienced attraction, pursued relationships, navigated the complex dance of romantic interest. This shouldn't feel so different, so significant, so charged with potential. But something about the moment, the way the cool night air wrapped around them, the way Daniel sat so close, his presence warm and steady, it made her heart beat a little too fast. There was a weight to this interaction, a gravity that exceeded the sum of their previous encounters, suggesting something more meaningful than simple attraction or chemistry. And before she could overthink it, before she could analyze and second-guess and retreat into safer territory, she just asked,